In this chapter, we'll be setting up the main controls so that we can move through the maze. First, let's open up our blend file. So open up game start.blend. Now the first thing to do is to make sure you have the Blender Game buttons enabled in the top menu here. So change it from Blender Menu to Blender Game. Like we learned in the last chapter, that will enable a whole set of buttons specific to the Blender Game engine, which are all hidden initially until you change it from Blender Render to Blender Game, and then they appear. Now let's pull up the logic editor window. This will be the window we use to add game logic. So drag up the timeline here, and let's split this window by left-clicking on the diagonal lines in the corner and dragging that all the way down. Now change that window from the timeline to the logic editor. This is where we add movement and controls and other game logic. On the left side is a property area, where we can add properties to objects in our game. We basically use properties to define something about an object. For example, we'll be given our key object the property keys, so that when the main character collides with an object with the keys property, we'll tell it that it can now open the locked door. The middle area here is where we'll add something called logic bricks. There's a column on the left side for sensors. The column in the middle is for controllers, and the column on the right is for actuators. Now, sensors are the triggers. They trigger events when something specific happens, like pressing a certain key on the keyboard, or collisions with certain objects, or lots of other things that you can see in this list here. Mouse actions, messages, properties, all that stuff. Sensors connect to controllers, which decide how the sensors are interpreted. The main ones here are and or. You can connect multiple sensors to a controller, and if the AND option is enabled, then every sensor connected to it must be true in order to trigger something. If you use the OR option, then if any of the sensors connected to it are true, it'll trigger something. I'm going to switch that back to AND and give you an example. If we add a keyboard sensor and click on the key field to define the key and press the space bar, and then add a collision sensor underneath that, click on the property field and type in ground, and let's connect both of these to the controller by clicking on the node on the side of it and dragging that to the node next to the controller. Do that for both of the sensors. And what this little setup here is saying now is that if we press the space bar while we're colliding with the ground, then something happens. Because we have them both connected to an AND controller, they both have to be true in order for something to happen. And that something in this case would be something like jump. If you press space bar while you're on the ground, then you're able to jump. The jump part is where actuators come in. Actuators are the action. This is what happens when the sensors are true. Here we can add movements, play animations, change properties, and lots of stuff. So if we were to make a jump motion at the end of this, I'd add a motion actuator. And then I'd connect it to the controller. And then I would do something like change the Z axis for location to 1 to give it some upward motion. So what this whole logic sentence is saying here is that if I'm on the ground and I press spacebar, then I'm going to move up on the Z-axis 1 unit. So that's the rundown on properties and logic bricks. Now that we've got a basic grasp on properties and logic bricks, let's get to work. Let's delete these logic bricks by clicking on the X's in the corners first. They were just an example. And now let's go into top view and select our camera at the bottom of the maze, right there, right at the start of the maze. Now this is a first-person view game, so our camera is basically our main character. But you typically don't want to add controls to your camera so that it can act independently of the main character sometimes. So let's create something else to add game controls to. With the camera selected, press Shift and S and select Cursor to Selected, which will place the cursor right where the camera is. Now press Shift and A, and we're going to add something called an empty. And an empty is just that, an empty object. It will not be visible except when editing. It will not render, and you will not see it in the game. So pick an empty type of your choice. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go with the classic arrows because it shows the letters on each of the axes. So I know which way this is pointing, and that's going to help us when we go to add movements to it. We'll know which direction is forward and backward and things like that. Let's go to side view with the empty selected. And let's move that down about 1.5 Blender units. Straight down on the Z-axis. Just so it's lower to the ground than the camera is. Good. Now since we're adding the controls to this, we want the camera to be attached to it. So select the camera, hold Shift, select the empty, and press Ctrl and P to parent it to the empty object. Now if you select the empty and move it around and rotate it, the camera is going to be attached to it, so it's going to do everything the empty does. So back in top view, or it doesn't really matter, but with the empty alone selected, what we need to do now is we need to make this object a dynamic object, so physics in the game will affect it. So let's go to the physics buttons over here in the properties window. Physics buttons are all the way on the end, that white bouncing ball, and change physics type from no collision to dynamic. And you'll notice a dotted sphere surrounding it now. That's our collision detection sphere. That's what will collide with things in the game. And you can change the size of the collision sphere by changing the radius setting here. Now we only need to change one thing in this area. Down in the damping options, change translation from 0.04 to 0.95. Damping is basically friction for the character's movement. Keeping that at a lower value will make your character slide more, but a higher value makes it slide less. And this is the easier way to do that. We can also select the ground and change its material settings, and let me show you that real quick. So let's select the ground here and go to the material buttons, and if you scroll down you'll see a panel for physics, and here you can increase or decrease the friction of this ground surface. So you can have multiple surfaces in your game with multiple materials. You can have an ice material and a concrete material. And the ice material, you'd just bring the friction all the way down close to zero. Concrete material, you'd crank that up to, I don't know, a higher value than zero. And you'll just test it out in the game to see how much friction you want. But I'm going to leave that at 0.5. Since we only have one surface in the game, I'm just going to change the damping settings on the main character itself instead of all the material settings for the surfaces. So again, all I did was I added an empty, I parented the camera to the empty, and in the physics buttons of the empty, I changed it to a dynamic object, and I increased its translation damping. Translation is basically just movement. Alright, now let's add some game logic. First, let's define this as the main character by giving it a property. So with the empty selected, add a game property for it by clicking on this button here. And rename this to main char. By default, the property type is float. And we can use this too, but to keep it organized, and since we don't need numbers for this, change the property type to Boolean, which has a checkbox next to it. This is the true or false kind of property. If you check the box, that property is true, and if it's unchecked, it's false. So let's check the box. The next step is to add all the movement. So add a new keyboard sensor, and click in this field here. Then you can press any key you want. So let's go with the up key and define our forward motion first. Change the name of this keyboard sensor to up, just to keep things organized and to know what our sensors are when we minimize them. So let's minimize it by clicking the arrow there. And now add a new controller, a regular AND controller, and connect that sensor to it. Now add a new motion actuator and connect the controller to that actuator. I'm going to drag this up a little bit. And in the motion actuator, go down to the force. In the force options here, change the Y value, because as you can see, forward for our empty object is the Y axis. So change force for the Y to 50. And rename this to forward motion. Minimize that. And now let's do the same thing but for backwards motion. So add a keyboard sensor, click on the key field, press the down arrow, rename it to down, minimize it, add an and controller, connect them, add another motion actuator, change the Y force to -50 this time, so it goes backwards. Rename this to backwards motion. Connect that to the controller. Minimize that. And just to make sure that these are working and we're adding force to the right axes, let's go into camera view by pressing the 0 on the numpad. Press Alt and Z, textured view here. Press the P key to play over the 3D view. And press up and down and see how it moves. Now if it's sliding too much or too little, you can just play with the damping value of the main character like we did before. But I think it looks good right now. Alright, so we got forward and backward motion situated here. I'm going to minimize these controllers to keep everything level. Now let's deal with turning. So let's do the same thing for turning right. Add a keyboard sensor, fill that field in with the right key, right key. Rename that to right, minimize that, add another and controller and connect them, add another motion actuator, connect them, and under the motion actuator, go to the rotation field here and change the z-axis from 0 to -2 degrees. Rename that to turn right. Minimize that. And do the same thing with turning left. Add a keyboard sensor, press left in the field, rename it to left, minimize, add an end controller, add another motion actuator, but this time change rotation on the z-axis to 2 degrees instead of -2. Rename that, turn left, connect them, minimize it, and there we go. So everything should work now once we press P and start walking around the maze. So let's see what happens. Hover over the 3D view, press the P key, forward, backward, left, right, perfect. Everything's good, and now we can roam our maze. So let's figure out how to interact with these keys now.